As far as I'm concerned, I don't have birthdays, I have seasons, and I'm looking forward to the season premieres each year.
You got canceled.
What happened? Oh, man. Some new supporting role.
He's going straight to streaming now.
That's right. But don't worry, you're not going to Netflix. You're not going to Disney Plus. You're going to Crackle.
Oh, no.
Welcome back to the Family Movie Night Podcast. This is episode 48, and we are here to help your family have better conversations around the content you consume. And today, we are talking about the Pixar amazing film from 2017, I believe. I don't have it pulled up. Coco. And here to help us talk about Coco, as always, is the hero of this podcast. Who we'll just go ahead and let you be Miguel in this, who is definitely, or Hector. Hector's a pretty good hero in this podcast. Donnie Dorsey.
As long as I get to play the music, as long as I get the guitar.
There you go. Yeah. That is the best pronunciation there you could go for this movie. That was the most southern pronunciation. The guitar.
That's right.
Very good. And then, of course, the villain of our podcast, Sawyer Hewlett, who I guess in this is just generational curses in the flesh and blood. Sawyer Hewlett.
I'm Benjamin Bratt. Okay, that's who I am. He's the villain of the movie.
Nope.
Okay,
nope.
Shouts out to the.
You're like that dog that gets turned into the
spirit guide or something like that.
Yeah, the spirit guide, and then eventually it's just a floating dog with tiny little wings. So that's who you get to be. All right, and of course, the mom of our podcast, Heidi Cooper, trying to rein us all in. How are you doing?
Oh, it's impossible. No, I'm just kidding.
Rowdy boys.
We're rowdy bunch.
Very excited to talk about this movie, though. And of course, Donnie Dorsey, before we get to that, why don't you explain what it is we do on this podcast?
Absolutely. So on this podcast, we encourage every family at Community Christian Church to have a monthly movie night to help you and your children build memories and start conversations that matter. The goal of our family ministry is to help you raise your children to love Jesus and his way of life above all other things. And we know that critical to that is for you to have a routine, regular time of connection, and some shared experiences that'll help you build stronger relationships.
And, movie nights are great opportunities to do that because movies are not just an easy way to share laughter and joy, fear and sadness in this safe environment, but they also give us a chance to talk about what matters most in ways that are meaningful and memorable with your children. And on this podcast, we want to not only recommend some movies you can watch on your monthly movie night, but give you some ideas of meaningful conversations you could have with your children during or after the movie.
And as always, the point of the podcast is definitely not to add one more thing to your list of things you feel guilty if you don't do as a parent. What we definitely want to do is make it easier for you and your kids to enjoy being together and build memories together, and then have conversations about those things that matter. So throughout our conversation today, remember, we just want to have fun and help you think through simple and easy ways to share your love of Jesus with your kids.
And today we think the movie we have is a wonderful opportunity to do that. Coco, in case you don't know, is a family film from Pixar that is about the following. Despite his family's generation-old ban on music, young Miguel dreams of becoming an accomplished musician like his idol Ernesto de la Cruz. Desperate to prove his talent, Miguel finds himself in the stunning and colorful land of the dead. After meeting a charming trickster named Hector, the two new friends embark on an extraordinary journey to unlock the real story behind Miguel's family, history. And we're going to be talking more about some of the themes surrounding that. But first, I just want to talk about why this movie works. I mean, what is it about this movie that just gets you excited to watch movies with your family? So, Donnie Dorsey, why don't you start and just tell us what is it about this movie that works for you, man?
I mean, okay, so I'm a steal a little something out of the villain's playbook here, and I'm gonna say this animation. Whoo! I'm
Spot on.
talking spot on. Like the detail, the intricacies of the backgrounds, the locations. I mean, it's so encapsulating and like entrancing a little bit to watch. And then the story of, this young kid that's trying to figure it out, and has no idea what he's doing, but he thinks he does. And then, dealing with all that, it's just, I mean, it's a chef's kiss.
Yeah, I was saying earlier, I think this might be the most beautiful Pixar movie, and there are lots of really beautiful Pixar movies.
Mhm.
But I think the colors on this, I think the design of it, just everything about it, the world building, just the Land of the Dead itself is just gorgeous to look at. We were saying before we started filming, I said maybe this will be exactly what heaven looks like. Like maybe it'll just be this colorful and beautiful and loud and like bold and everything. Just absolutely gorgeous. A lot of fun there. The villain of our podcast, Sawyer Hewlett. How did you feel about Coco?
I liked it. I was saying earlier before we were recording, like this movie's like a cheat code for my emotions. I hadn't seen it before. I might have seen it once, like at like a party or something like that. I don't remember. I did not remember anything about this movie, other than I remembered, wow, that old lady is really well animated. That's really the only thing I remembered from this movie.
On your scale of old lady animation, where does this fall?
Oh, this is the top, okay?
Okay, gotcha.
And at the very bottom is Batman the Animated Series, okay? So, which is a show I love, but
does it have particularly bad old lady animation?
Well, they're the exact same models as every other woman in the show. So
gotcha.
Yeah,
they just have her hunch over a little.
Yeah, exactly. But no, I freaking love this movie. Let me tell you, I like in terms of movies where it's like it just like activates my emotions. The ending scene when he plays his guitar for Coco, like entering that scene, I was like, oh, this is gonna be a really sweet scene. Literally, the guitar gets strumming, and I'm like, like it's just like lump in my throat instantly. I'm like, it was like instant. It was so fast. It caught me off guard. It was, yeah. I mean, like I'm like getting emotional just thinking about it. It's such a beautiful movie, such a great story, really intimate and stuff like that. We're going to get into the themes, and it's a very broad movie. But I think my favorite idea behind the themes of this movie is just how intimate it is. It's about this little boy who has a passion, and he has to find a way to glorify, to bring it before his family is the thing. And it's just such a beautiful moment, the way that he figures out how to do that. So, yeah.
I agree. No, I just think this is an absolutely gorgeous film. I think for me, as it probably doesn't shock anyone, I cried like 4 times in this movie. And my kids, I actually think one of my daughters was crying and was trying to hide it. I don't know why, because I'm like a very emotionally vulnerable dad, but like she was like, I can't let my dad know I'm crying at this movie. So, but yeah, just very emotional all the way through. And of course, I gotta imagine.
Does she normally pick on you for your emotions?
No, I don't know if she does. One of them. No, but I mean, they all tease me about the fact that I cry during every movie, but I don't know. I was just about to say, if I was crying in this movie, Heidi must have just been the puddle of my own tears. Cause I gotta imagine if I was emotional, Heidi was losing it in this movie.
Yeah, it's a super emotional movie. There's so many wonderful things I could talk about, but just the relationships to family and, the closeness that his family has, despite their issues and clear dysfunction, they are just a really sweet family. And the way that they are represented in the movie is really cool too.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this movie is just killer. I think your family's going to love it. If they haven't already seen it, if they have, you probably already watched it 30 times. And of course, it's the Halloween season, which is why we're watching this now. This is a great fall Halloween kind of movie at this time. And anyway, we want to get into that, but we want to talk about just the themes of this movie. And we said before we even started filming, because we had a long conversation before we filmed, even about what are we going to cover and what are we going to kind of talk about to you guys, because there's so much in this movie, as there are in many of the movies we cover. But this one in particular, I think, has so much to say about family, has so much to say about what does it mean to honor your parents, honor your family, but also, honor God and yourself. I mean, one thing just right off the bat that I want to have just a brief conversation about is I think this movie gives us a good opportunity to just talk about the afterlife. Like what is life after death, look like? Because what the premise of this movie is, this is Dia de los Muertos, where on the Day of the Dead, the characters in this movie are able to travel. The characters from the land of the dead are able to travel to the real world, the land of the living, if their picture is put up to be honored on this day by their family. And if anyone in the land of the living is dying and they're the last person to remember you, you disappear in the land of the dead. If you are no longer remembered, you basically cease to exist, it seems. And I had a really good conversation with my kids about, they said, well, is that what's going to happen to me? Like, if nobody remembers me, am I going to get lost? And I got to have a good conversation with them of saying, well, this isn't exactly what, Jesus says that life, the afterlife, life with him, life in his kingdom is going to be like. I said, but the one good thing to know is that we do go on, there is life after death. And that what Jesus says is that if we honor him, if we remember him, if we follow him, that he will always remember us. And so even long after, generations after anyone remembers my name or remembers stories about me, God will always remember me. And I'm always safe in his kingdom. And so that's a good just conversation for them to understand that this idea that, but for them to know that, the relationships we make, the way that we choose to live, it does affect our afterlife. And so there's good conversations there. Anyone else have good conversations just around the idea of the afterlife in general? I know Heidi and I were talking a little bit about it beforehand. Heidi, were there any good things that you were able to talk about just about the afterlife in general?
Yeah, I think for me, I was able to just kind of point back to my kids and say, like, this is sort of a fantastical or like imaginative, way that we can look at the afterlife. And there's beautiful parts about it that I'm sure like will be true, will resonate, in whatever heaven actually looks like. But the most important part is, like what we also talked about before this was, just like kind of being willing to like remember or to talk about the people that came before you, and not because you have to or because there's some kind of obligation. None of that is real, but because they shaped who you are, and therefore you are shaping somebody else, and that's important to kind of pass that along and have those conversations.
Yeah, and I think being able to have these conversations with our kids about, and I love that final song that he sings about our love for each other will live on forever. Like that idea, I was able just to repeat that to our kids, that is what matters, and not necessarily just our love for one another, but that at the center of that love is God, who is love, and that love is eternal. And if we make our life about loving God and loving others, then Jesus will remember us forever. And that's what his kingdom. And, we don't have to have these scary conversations about, hell, and you don't want to go to hell. And you want to, you can have these beautiful conversations about what life with God will be like and want to draw them towards life with God, which is really, our hope as parents. So,
yeah. And, it also talks about in the Bible that we get to experience it with fellow believers. And so that's another exciting part is like, well, you might not ever get to meet your great grandma or your, grandfather on your dad's side or whoever, but, you might one day when we're all together in heaven, so that's another cool part to be able to point to that this movie shows really well, in a fun way.
Well, and even believers who that we all become a part of what, early believers refer to as the communion of saints, that goes on forever, that before the throne of God there are just believers who are there at all times, and they are loving God, and that I get to interact not just with my biological family, but I get to be a part of this family of God that is even bigger than that. And, Mother Teresa and, these kind of like great saints that went before us, Paul and Peter, and, who knows, like we will all be a part of the same kind of thing. And so, like you said, even if here on earth, I may not know all of my biological family or legal family or whatever, I have this bigger family of God that I get to belong to that does exist forever. And so it is that love for each other, love for God, that really does live on forever, and we get to be a part of that. So I think this movie does give you a chance just to have that conversation. We had multiple conversations about that. But the bigger theme, and this is what you would have seen when you clicked on the episode, is we want to talk about this idea of, one, why does family matter? Why does God put us in families? This is a good opportunity just to have good conversations about family in general, right? That family matters, and that God put us in families really to be an example of his love for us, right? Because he refers to himself as our Father. So that, we get to represent as parents God to our children, but also that the family would be an example of the church, that really my primary family would not be the family I'm born into, that my primary family wouldn't be the family that we share the same last name, but that it would be this bigger family of the church. And the way that I learn to love my brothers and sisters in real life can either benefit me in the church, or it can really be something I have to overcome, right? That all of these things. And that's a bigger part that we want to talk about that. And we see this in this movie of the kind of generational curses that are placed on this family that then become things that Miguel, generations later, has to overcome in order to really love and honor God. And so, and obviously he in this movie is not trying to love and honor God, but that your children would be able to love and honor God. And so I wanted to kind of start there in our conversation. And so Heidi, why don't you start by having that? You had kind of brought this up beforehand of why it's important that we have conversations about, generations and the people who came before us, but in particular in helping our kids to understand themselves and to understand their life in honoring God.
Yeah, totally. I think that, from my experience, like we didn't talk very much about a lot of like the negative things and certain things that, maybe should have been talked about and would have kind of clarified some of the, behavior or things like that. And I think I think my overall message to parents on this would just be like, tell stories, talk about these things with your kids, talk openly and as honestly. Obviously, it has to be age appropriate. You don't want to tell your 3-year-old about, their drunk uncle so and so and what they did at, Thanksgiving a decade ago. But, you do kind of want to just be real with them as early on as possible and honest with them. And so I think, yeah, it's just tell stories and in equal measure, the ones that show the good parts about your family, and the ones that, also kind of provide a little insight to your kids about maybe why certain things are a little bit more challenging in your family. And I just think it really helps kids to develop a sense of self in order to like see, okay, well, here's the kind of person that, I'm kind of like, I lean towards in my individuality, but I know that God has a purpose for me. And so these are some of the ways that I've, been gifted, or some of the things that I've learned through life that I can use to honor him. And so I think it's kind of a way of helping you to better connect to the church and to the family of God, and seeing, other people as family and people you can connect with and grow from, by having that kind of fundamental honesty about who you are, where you came from within your family.
Well, and I think to that point, Heidi, I think it's why it's really important. And I know this is hard for a lot of families, but it's why it's really important that at whatever age you can, as you said, age appropriate, we don't have family secrets. We don't have these like, oh, we don't talk about, because that's what happens in this movie. If you don't know, in Coco, there's, and we joked about it's in Encanto too. We don't talk about Bruno. We just don't talk about that. We don't talk about that person. We don't talk about that part of our history. We don't talk about, this person used to be here and they don't struggle with that anymore. So we don't even talk about it. But it's important that a child be able to understand, because we often, as Westerners, but I think this is really true everywhere. I think family secrets are cross-cultural, cross everywhere. Everyone has, we want to hold on to. But I think as Americans, we see ourselves as individuals first. And we like to think, I was like formed from the clay. Like I just came up and that's who I am. But this idea that I belong to a family, right, that has shaped who I am. And there's biology that shapes who I am, right? We now know that alcoholism, there's even genetic markers to predispositions towards those things. And so to not be honest with our kids and be like, hey, for some people, it might be okay for them when they're 21 to have a beer or to whatever, or however you as a family want to talk about that. But you, because of our family history, you may want to stay completely away from that because it's just not okay for you. Or maybe because of, Heidi already mentioned, I have to talk to my kids a lot about, I have a lot of anger stuff. My dad had a temper. I have a temper. That's a part of it. The likelihood that you will have a similar thing is going to be a part of it. But that's just part of us learning, how do I love Jesus? And so, I think all of that goes to it. And Heidi mentioned, sharing both good and bad stories. But I think sometimes as parents, we want to shy away from the bad stories. And I think it's because we don't want to taint their image of like grandma or grandpa or whoever it is. We're trying to be very protective. Maybe we're trying to protect ourselves. How do we as parents have that conversation though? Like, how do you go about that conversation where you show both grace, because you don't want to be judgmental, but you're also honest?
So if I answer this question, then I would say that you can kind of like go like with the Bible and see how they did it. How like how we can see Abraham and we can just read the stories of how it's he's amazing and the things that he did, but there are also stories in there about his his indiscretions and the terrible, horrible things that he did, and his Moses, like, yeah, he saved a whole the people of God, the whole group, but he also was a murderer, he was a liar, he was a trickster, and kind of a coward in a lot of ways as well. And so there's so many different things that we want. I think it is just as important in those tough conversations to just remind our kids, like, just like you're human and you make mistakes, and just like mommy does too, same with grandpa, or same with great grandpa, and they did this thing that I really had an effect on the whole family. And so, I just want to make sure you're aware of it and that we talk about those things so that if you have any questions, I can be here to answer. I think that's the biggest thing, is we just kind of want to like be real, be honest, be fair. And, and really it's more about the information that they need to help them, to guide them, in what they might face as a result of, the family that they either were born into or are being brought up in.
Yeah, I know that when we have done foster training and things of that nature, what they always say is that kids should know every part of their story by the time they are 10. And when that they mean in that sense, like their birth story, their adoption history, all that kind of stuff, that you shouldn't try and keep any of that secret. Obviously, you have to have those conversations in varying levels of whatever that looks like. But I think it's also true for just things in your family, that by the time a kid's age 10, they should be able to. There shouldn't be secrets that should be so deep, because we tend to think that those are things that we have to hide. But, not many of us maybe are going to have like these deep, deep family secrets we have to bring. But I do think just the part that you talked about, Heidi, of I've got sins in my past, right? I know parents who are like, I don't want to talk about the fact that I had sex before I was married, or I experimented with drugs and alcohol, or I did, I snuck out of the house. I don't want to tell them any of those things because I don't want them to repeat those behaviors. But there's a benefit to, and I think these are the two things, or I don't want them to change their image of me. But this is the thing I think is huge. And Donnie, it looked like you were going to say something, so maybe you can incorporate this or totally abandon this. I don't care. But go ahead.
So what I was thinking about, like kind of going what y'all were talking about, is I think it's important as a parent to create a safe space for honest conversations. Because a lot of times I think, like what y'all were saying, is that we do sometimes try to protect ourselves or the legacy that is out there for our family. And we neglect to say the truth of all of it, because it's the idea is like, there's the truth, and then there's the other person's truth, and then there's what actually happened. And I think as parents we have to be willing to accept and have that conversation and let our kids, and like what Heidi was saying, is it has to be age appropriate. If there's an issue with things, maybe it's like, hey, um I wouldn't do this particular thing because from our family's history, this could lead down a different path. And then when maybe they don't have the questions then, but they come back to you a year later or 6 months later and they say, well, what did you mean? And then
Yeah.
you can have that honest conversation, because I think so much we want to have this perfect conversation right away. But instead of having that perfect conversation, we just need to make sure the door is open. It's kind of like that idea of, like, as a parent, you leave your door cracked just in case your kids need you,
Yeah.
because you want them to know that you're there. But we're not going to be like, hey, look here, go look, this is everything you will ever need to know. Don't be afraid. And they're like, ah.
Well, and I think what we allow, so let's say when you're having these conversations and your fear is a little bit like, I don't want to, if I'm telling the truth about something and they may think differently of me, or they may think differently of their mom, or their grandpa, grandma, whatever. I honestly think they will think differently. And I think it's good, because what it allows them to do now is to actually have grace for people, and not to, on either side, vilify a person. Because that's what we see in this movie, right? Is they had vilified this grandpa character who had, or great great grandpa, who had kind of gone off. And now we don't ever listen to music because of this, right? And they'd come, or what happens to a lot of people is, my grandpa's never done anything bad. My grandma's never done anything bad. My mom never does anything bad. And it allows them to see the truth. And this helps inform for themselves, that they can have grace for themselves, that all people are a mixture of sinner and saint. All people have good and bad qualities. And to be honest about those things, you're actually freeing up your children to have honest and important conversations. And so I think the more that you can do that, you're actually opening the door for grace. And because if you reveal all of this information at probably the most critical and judgmental age, 17, it's not going to be good, because they will think, I have all the experience I need to make up my mind about people. But if this becomes just a part of growing up, and once again, I don't want to make this sound like what you're revealing. You're probably not revealing, by the way, your grandfather was involved with the Kennedy assassination to bring Kennedy back up. You're bringing
you're way cooler than we all thought our audience.
And by the way, don't tell anybody we told you this, okay?
That's right. That's right.
We could still face charges.
That's right. But what you are bringing up is, hey, I didn't handle my sexuality well. Or, hey, I didn't always handle my anger. Or, you know what? I got in trouble with the law. Or I got in trouble with X, Y, and Z. And you're just revealing. And the point is not to bring up the secret. The point is to aid your kid in being able to understand their predispositions to things. And once again, that's not at 6. It's just, you got to have these conversations so they can understand the challenges they have in loving God and loving people, because we all have challenges. And that's the thing that I have a lot with conversation with my kids, because we come from varying degrees of challenges in my family. And to be able to say to them, everyone needs help with something. This is just the specific thing you need help with. And that's different.
Yeah, it's because it's that idea of like, it's damage doesn't mean broken beyond repair, because Jesus taught us that very much so through the individuals that he chose to begin his ministry with, is that. And I think a lot of times it's that, just reminding ourselves that, look, I have things that I've done. And like you said, like, maybe it's not the worst thing in the sense of like the magnitude of it, but maybe it's that thing your kid needs to hear, that they will encounter a person down the road and go, man, you're angry. My dad or my mom was very angry, but I saw how much they could change, and they see an opportunity to show grace to someone because they first saw it in a person that they respected and loved.
So let me pitch just a idea of how this conversation could go when you're watching this movie. Because that's what we do here. We're trying to have conversations around the content. So you're watching this movie, and there's a scene in the movie where he finds out that this grandpa, he always thought his grandpa was this De La Cruz character who is like, basically, it's like Elvis or like Julio Iglesias, like national treasure singer, songwriter person, right? And he finds out not only is that not his ancestor, he actually murdered and stole the songs of his great-great-grandpa. And they have this moment where not only does he find that out, but then he brings his great-great-grandfather back to his wife, which is the kind of matriarch of the family. And there's this moment where there's just all of this understanding kind of washing over the audience, washing over the family. And to be able to say to our kids in that moment, hey, isn't it cool that there's forgiveness happening and there's grace that's happening? And even though both people, she had written him off, did kind of at first abandon his family. Like there's brokenness. Both people did something wrong.
Yeah.
But everyone is a mixture of good and bad. Everyone is a mixture of good and bad. And then maybe even say, I haven't always gotten things right. Mama, papa, or your grandma and grandpa, they didn't always get things right. And there are things that I struggle with now that, when I was a kid, mama and papa, they didn't always treat me exactly the way Jesus would want them to have treated me. And I'm not always going to treat you the way that Jesus wants me to treat you. But what's important is that we learn to love and forgive, that we apologize when we do wrong. So that's a good way to just introduce the conversation of none of us family. There are no perfect families.
Nope.
And we need to be honest about it. We need to apologize, but we also need to give grace for one another.
Yeah.
So anything else to add on that? I want to switch gears for just a second, but anything else on that idea? Okay. I think in the same vein, so we've already talked about, we got to give grace, and we're going to have these generational kind of sins and curses, these things that kind of affect us. Heidi had said this before we started filming, but the people who raised you, they had someone who raised them, and they had someone who raised them, and all of those kind of things, they follow us throughout our life. But the reverse is true too. The reverse is true, that we can leave a good legacy. We can leave a legacy of following Christ. And so I think back on my family, and I know my daughter, Corinne, is named after my great-grandmother. So my mother's grandmother, who was also named Corinne, and was this the whole time I was growing up, was this godly woman. I was just told of, she's this godly woman. She read the Bible, all day long. She would just read and pray, and she had the character of Christ and the nature of Christ, and that was always very inspiring to me. And knowing that, both sets of grandparents on my side of the family, they all went to church. And they were involved in church, and they loved God. And even knowing, and my dad has been open about this, that both he and my grandfather didn't go to church when they weren't or they did go to church, but they were not following Jesus. They did not really commit themselves to Jesus until later in life. That has informed a legacy of faith for me that we get to continue. And we know this just by and large, that the pastors in America who tend to have like the most influence and the most impact of those things are themselves generational pastors. That it is people who they just continue to influence, and families that continue to do this. Now, I don't say that if you're the first person in your family to be a Christian, if you're the first person that somehow now you failed because you have all these things and you can't control that. I want to throw this out there too on this. Someone was the first person to start the generational sin. Someone can be the first person to start the generational blessing. You can be the first one to say, from this point on, those things don't come past me. They don't come past me. And I'm thankful for both of my parents who have told me, of things that they knew that their parents did. And they said, I just said, I'm never going to do that. I'm never going to do that. And then I, as a parent, can do the same thing. And we can continue to create legacies of faith going forward. These legacies of blessing, not curses, blessing that go forward. Do you guys have anything to add to that idea of just being able to give our kids this legacy of blessing?
Yeah, I think kind of like what, along the same lines of what you were saying, but a little bit different, is that in talking to them openly about these things, and it gives each generation, like you were saying, a little bit more of an opportunity to get this better, like to at least get a little closer to what Jesus would have us look like on these things, that the way that, we can create a whole generation of a family who's, been riddled with addiction, is to have a generation where they're so aware of where they come from and they're sensitive to that, but they don't also live in total and complete fear. And so it's just like you said, like just being honest about things, being open about things, saying, well, yeah, we're not going to do this, but this is something they really got right. And so we're going to move forward and, add to that, build on that. And so that's the whole, like you said, it could be a generational curse, but it can also be a generational foundation of faith that, no matter when it started or where you picked it up, you can move the needle for your kids in a big way. And that will make a huge difference in their lives. And then those lives, that you don't even necessarily think about when you're raising kids, but the ones that come after and after that, and, so on and so forth.
Donnie, you sounded like you were going to say something earlier.
I mean, I think Heidi summed it up pretty well. I mean, in the sense of like going from what the past was and then turning it into a foundation of faith, because I was talking about it with my mom and also my wife, is that it's very cool to watch how much my children know about the Bible more than I ever did, and how much their love for it and their like passion for it is. And I'm like, I didn't get that necessarily when I was their age, but like we were talking about, I have an opportunity to give that to them. And then as they build their legacy from our legacy, they now can have a bigger and greater and stronger foundation that changes the world that I may never see.
Yeah. Well, and I think this whole conversation is just to kind of boil it back down so that we can kind of get it, is the goal of this is what did come before us. And, this is all throughout Coco. What came before us, it does affect who we are, but it does not have to determine who we are. And that we get the opportunity, whether it's through honest conversations with our kids, or maybe it's an honest assessment on our own part to look at these things. I remember, I think they're called genograms, if you want to look them up, like GEN-ogram, where you kind of diagram 3 to 4 generations of your family, and you just kind of look towards trends. Like maybe you find out, almost every man in these 3 years was divorced and remarried at some point. And that's a trend line. Or everyone in these, they struggled with some level of addiction, or they struggled with anger, or they cut people out of their families, and that influences me. And maybe you want to look and just go, how can I make sure that doesn't happen going forward? Or how can I look back and see the blessings, the legacy of faith, and how can I continue that? But just as parents, to be aware and to be honest and to have these conversations with our kids, I think are so important. But most of all, to have grace. Every family, the center of every family has to be grace, because we are going to fail. We are going to mess up, and we want to make sure that we have at the center of our family this center of the grace of God that says we're all broken and we all fail, but we all are also made in the image of God, which means we have infinite potential for good if we surrender to Him. So we want to thank you guys for listening in on this week's episode and helping your kids to love Jesus and His way of life even more. And we will see you next week.